When you saw today's sermon title, The Wedding of the Century, you probably assumed that I was talking about Ray and Randy's wedding today. That was the wedding of the 21st century. The wedding I'm referring to today occurred in the 1980s, so it's the wedding of the 20th century. It was a wedding officiated by Robert Fulghum, who is a Unitarian Universalist minister. Fulghum gained notoriety, you probably remember, in 1988 from a book he wrote called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. In one of his other books he wrote after that, he tells of an unforgettable wedding he was involved with. He says that the bride was a beautiful young woman from Brooklyn, from a huge family, from Polish immigrant stock, and Jewish. Her tall, dark, and handsome fiance hailed from Detroit, also from a large family, also from immigrant stock, but Irish and Roman Catholic. It was bad enough that both the young man and the young woman went west to Seattle to pursue a graduate degree. It was bad enough that they didn't settle down with someone from the old neighborhood, but to fall in love and then to think of marrying someone not like us was traumatic, a catastrophe for the entire family, unthinkable. But Ms. Detroit and Mr. Brooklyn were young and overwhelmed with love. And love, they were quite certain, could find a way through any obstacle. At first, the couple planned to elope, not telling their families in an attempt to avoid any hard feelings. But they loved their parents. And they knew that they would be hurt, especially if they didn't have some kind of religious ceremony. And so they decided that they would have a nice-sized wedding at a church in Seattle. They called their mothers and invited them to the wedding. They called from the minister's house, from Robert Fulghum's office, and he says his phone has not been working right ever since. Probably fried the wires all the way back to Detroit and Brooklyn. The mothers were united in their response, "You're marrying a what?" Followed by silence and sobbing. Then the fathers got on the line. They also united in their response. "Come home now." For a month, the mail and the phone calls rushed in. Uncles and aunts and cousins got into it. The rabbi wrote a 30-page letter. The priest and the nuns prayed. The families were not coming, ever. The families threatened blackmail. Bribes were offered. But nothing could dissuade the couple, not even being disinherited, which was the ultimate threat thrown at both of them by both families. Not that the bride and groom were unmoved. They spent a whole lot of time in Robert Fulghum's office, the bride sobbing, the groom swearing. But the couple, you see, came from tough resilient stock from people who had made it the hard way and had always told their kids not to back off when they believed in something. And they believed in each other. The kids were doing exactly what their parents had taught them to do, and that was that. The tiebreaker in this standoff was Grandma, the grandmother of the groom. If her grandson was getting married, even if it was to a you-know-what, she was going to be there. Granny was serious. She went out and bought a ticket. She was going to the wedding. Thus, the dominoes began to fall. If Grandma was going to the wedding, then she couldn't go alone. She would need some support, you know. So pretty soon, all of the Irish Catholics from Detroit were coming. They'd show those Jewish yahoos from Brooklyn what real family loyalty was about. And they'd bring Uncle Dickie, the priest, to keep things as godly as possible. Well, you know what happened next. 35 Brooklyn Jews, including Grandfather Rabbi, had plane tickets. They weren't going to be outdone by the Irish Catholics. And so the wedding began to look like a grudge match between Notre Dame and Jerusalem Tech. Sure enough, they all came. And when they arrived in Seattle, then it really got complicated. Grandfather Rabbi begged to at least be allowed to say a traditional blessing in Hebrew at the end of the service. When the Irish Catholics got wind of this, they insisted that Grandma, who had once performed in light opera, sing Ave Maria. All that the bride and groom could seem to do was nod their heads, smile, and say, whatever. Come the great day, a Saturday evening after sundown to please the you-know-whats. The families marched into the church and sat down, or rather dug in on either side of the aisle. Robert Fulgham, the minister, said that he would have given 6 to 5 odds that there was going to be a free-for-all after the service instead of a reception. But he said that he had forgotten about love. For the Irish Catholics from Detroit loved the groom, as did the Polish Jews from Brooklyn love the bride. They were wonderful young people, worthy of pride and respect, even if they didn't have a brain in their heads when it came to choosing a mate. And even the most bitter critic of the match would have had a hard time ignoring how handsome the groom was and how enchanting the bride. And when the bride began to weep and the groom embraced her and began to weep too, the whole church was flooded with tears. The service grounded to a halt while everyone had a good cry. Even Uncle Dickie the priest luring in the vestibule, lest he get contaminated by the proceedings, was seen dabbing his eyes and blowing his nose. It was then that the grandmother of the groom, the grand matriarch of the Irish Catholics, 78 years old, rose to sing Ave Maria. She did not go all the way to Seattle, Washington, to let her grandson down. She stood by the piano, took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and delivered the goods. Never has one heard the song offered with more feeling, more passion, more fervor. She was magnificent. Not the scratchy, over-dramatic sounds one might expect from an aging third-rate opera singer. No, this was the voice of a grandmother distilling her life into the music for a once-in-a-lifetime occasion to honor what she loved and believed in. When the last lovely note faded and silence held them firm, grandmother opened her eyes, smiled at her grandson, and said, "There now." And the Brooklyn Jews gave her a spontaneous standing ovation. They might not have known what was proper to do in church, but they knew music. And they knew Grandma had given it all she had, and they knew great love when they saw it. She was their kind of guy, and a standing O was called for. Yeah, Grandma! Well, Grandfather Rabbi was not to be outdone. He walked slowly to stand close by the bride and groom. He reached out and took their hands in his, and then, speaking for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of the Jews in Brooklyn, speaking for all of them, he laid out a blessing on the couple that ought to last them the rest of their lives. I mean, they were blessed. And you didn't have to understand Hebrew to know it. And so, of course, as you might hope, the Irish Catholics gave Grandfather Rabbi a standing ovation he will never forget. Then the minister sighed a deep sigh of relief, knowing that joy and love had won the day. What the families had not understood until then, Fulgham said, was that they had many of the same values and traditions, despite their arguments over metaphors. They believed in family, in faith, in love, the same God, and the capacity to celebrate those things. The bride and groom rushed off down the aisle to the reception hall where a polka band was waiting. Grandfather Rabbi asked grandmother opera singer to dance. The crowd roared and the party was on. Never has there been such dancing and singing and eating and laughing. A year later, close to the anniversary of this amazing occasion, Robert Fulgham, the minister, received a postcard from a cruise ship in the Caribbean. From the bride and groom, he assumed. No. From the parents of the bride and groom, who have become great friends. What a great story. About 6 years after the book came out with this story in it, my oldest daughter, Chelsea, who was 3 or 4 years old at the time, had the opportunity to do a print ad with Robert Fulghum. The ad was shot near Atlanta and was funded by the Governor's Office of Highway Safety and an organization called Safe Kids of Savannah. The ad was encouraging children to look both ways when crossing a street, to be very careful of traffic. Chelsea was one of 7 children used in the ad, and the picture was of Robert Fulghum and the children carefully crossing the street together. And I suppose they chose Fulghum to star in the ad because he was identified with children due to his book, All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Anyway, I brought the ad to church today. It will be in the social hall during coffee hour if you want to take a look at it. Chelsea is the smallest child in the picture. She's on Fulghum's right side holding his hand, and another child who grew up at Asbury, Sarah Jones, is also in the picture. She's the little blonde on Fulghum's left side holding his hand. Well, after the shoot was over, I moseyed on over to Mr. Fulghum and introduced myself, told him I was a big fan, and then I couldn't resist. By the way, I said, the couple you wrote about, are they still together? He looked at me and said, unfortunately, they are not. And my heart sank. Dadgummit, I thought to myself, there goes a great sermon. Can't preach that one anymore. Well, Robert Fulghum must have sensed my disappointment, because then he added, but their separation didn't have anything to do with their religious or cultural differences. Then he said, and you need to know this. Their parents are still good friends. In fact, they still take a trip together every year. Well, that's pretty cool, but I have to admit, I was still disappointed. In fact, back in the late 80s and early 90s, I used to preach this sermon periodically, and then I rarely used it once I found out that the couple was no longer together. But as I have gotten older, I have reclaimed the story, and the sermon has taken a new shape. Because I realized that I was bitten by the Cinderella syndrome, always expecting everyone to live happily ever after. As I have gotten older and have experienced a good many years in ministry, I have come to realize that no one lives happily ever after. The reality is that many things we have hoped for or planned don't come to fruition. Many marriages do fall apart. Some friendships we thought we'd have forever are no longer there for one reason or another. Promising jobs sometimes turn into major disappointments. It's part of life. Those things happen and always will. What should not be part of life, what should not happen, is the kind of animosity and disdain those families had for one another before the wedding. And with this new knowledge about the couple from Robert Fulghum, I have come to realize that the real miracle of this story is not the coming together of two different families at the wedding, but that these families have continued to come together even when their children have not. Think about that. That's pretty remarkable. Love truly did win the day. It was more powerful than prejudice. What we call the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians was really his second letter to them. We don't have the first letter he wrote to the Corinthians, nor do we have the letter the members of the church in Corinth wrote to Paul responding to his first letter. He founded this Christian community around 50 A.D. Corinth was a major city and seaport, kind of the New York City of its day, in southern Greece. Paul thought it was the most important city in Greece. It was very diverse with both Gentiles and Jews and everything in between. He spent 18 months with this community on his first visit. After he had been away from them for 2 or 3 years, he learns that there are all kinds of divisions within the faith community back in Corinth. Much of this letter, what we call the First Corinthians, addresses these conflicts. The community was divided into factions based on who their mentors were. Some were following Paul, others were following a man named Apollos, a third group following Peter, a fourth group following Christ. Who was right? What was the right side to be on? Who was better? Sound familiar? Another thing they argued over was spiritual gifts. Who had more? Whose gifts were more important? Who was more powerful? Then there was the division between those who were wealthy and the majority who were not. All of these divisions stem from egos and pride. It's to this environment of division and squabbles that Paul writes what we have come to call the love chapter that Sandra read for us so beautifully today. That's the entire 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, a text you often hear at weddings. Love is patient, love is kind, faith, hope, and love abide. But the greatest of these is love. Incredible words, brilliant, however, they didn't help. Things got worse in Corinth. Paul had to write a third, fourth, and fifth letter to them, trying to get the people of Corinth to deal with their diversity and their egos. Those incredible words that he wrote almost 2,000 years ago that are read at almost every wedding didn't help, because the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians is really a text of terror. Because it's describing sacrificial love. And the ego doesn't like sacrificial love. With the Corinthians being divided on who to follow, Paul answers them with not so much of a who, but a what. He says to them, what you follow is Christ crucified. What you do is be like the one who is willing to give up one's life for another. So stop arguing about who is the best, the holiest, the smartest, and who deserves recognition and position and power. Paul says, I will show you a more excellent way, love. And love does not insist on its own way. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the right, in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. The people of Corinth never seemed to get that. The Catholics from Detroit and the Jews from Brooklyn did. So what about us? Will we get it?